Hi everyone, it's Henry here. A lot of you have been enjoying the recent corrosion and decay series we were doing where I was using a skeleton as the sort of demonstration piece. And quite a few of you have been in touch to ask, am I going to finish it? And the truth is, I haven't really decided on what scheme I want to do the skeletons and the undead models from the Cursed City box. But I thought in this video I'd address the last major part of the model, which is the cloth. And we'll take a look at a fun couple of ways that we can make any sort of cloth look sort of old, tattered, decayed, muddy, that sort of thing. So let's paint. You can use this technique on any colour cloth you want, but for this demo I've just picked a Screamer Pink to base coat it with and I added a little blue and did some simple highlights. We'll look at addressing painting cloth in tons of different ways over all sorts of army painting videos, so whatever colour you want, you're good to go. On my palette I've got two contrast paints, Goregrunta Fur and GW-CYGOR Brown. We're going to thin it out with a little water and then we're going to touch the excess off our brush so we haven't got much more than you can see there on that second pass. It's because I don't want to flood the model with tons of the paint. The contrast paints are very saturated, which means they're a very strong colour. So we can apply them in very, very thin layers, but they will still give us colour. And it also means we can achieve quite smooth blends relatively easily. Now all I'm doing is moving my brush from the middle of where I want the mud, which is what this brown's going to represent, the middle of where I want that to start, and then moving my brush all the way to the ends of the torn fabric. The reason we do this is so that when I remove my brush at the end of the torn piece of fabric, that's where the majority of the paint's going to stay. Now once it's dried, you can see we've got a very, very subtle effect here. Effectively what we're doing here is glazing in a colour. And I'm going to repeat the process. I'm going to do this a couple of times and we can build up the intensity of that colour. Contrast paint dries much stronger than it goes on, so it's always worth waiting in between each layer. As I said a moment ago, what I want this to represent is sort of mud and dirt sort of caked in and discoloured all the cloth. And the next stage where we add a darker brown, it may even look like it's been scorched a little. But especially the way the GW sculpt a lot of their undead stuff, you can have a ton of this cloth with these weird little frayed ends. It's quite a nice way of adding a bit of detail to them. The last little thing I'm going to do is stipple on a little bit of that contrast mix. Now I've got slightly more on my brush now than I did when we were glazing it in, and that's because I want to create little puddles of this brown on the model. And what will happen is as that dries, the pigment will get pushed out to the edges of those little puddles and we'll get those little tide marks that a lot of the time we really don't want. But all we're trying to do here is get sort of texture and the idea that sort of wet mud or moisture or whatever has stained this cloth. So the more texture, little tide marks, things like that, the better. Once that's dried, I've moved to the darker brown. So in this case, GW-CYGOR Brown. There's like a million contrast paint browns. Like, go and have a play with them. They're good fun. Find the ones you like. And all we do here is exactly the same process of glazing towards the end of the cloth. We're just starting, I don't know, roughly halfway down where we had the previous brown. You could do this with paint or ink or whatever. It's just contrast paints that are super easy to do it with. Again, when we're army painting, I'm often looking for products that I know will do a job well. And the nice thing about the contrast paints is the product does the job well, but we've also got a wide variety of colours to choose from. But if you wanted to, you could really make up any colour you wanted to behave like this if you just grab a pot of the contrast medium and then find an ink for the colour you want. So a few layers of this, and we've got this really nice deep dark brown on the ends of that tattered cloth. We've got a variety of finishes now between sort of satin and gloss depending on what paint we've used, and I just want to unify them a little bit, so I'm just doing a couple of sprays of ultra matte varnish there. You could brush this on with a hairy brush if you needed to. You don't need to airbrush it at all. I would be doing the cloth at the beginning of this process before I did all the armour stages. Now you can look at using oil to create some weathering effects on the cloth. We could just leave it with the contrast paint, that looks really nice. crack on. But I thought I'd cover a few different ways that we can approach it. So I've taken a brown, in this case burnt umber, and I've taken a colour called Dust by Abteilung 502. You can see it's sort of an off-white. Now I take some mineral spirits. I use odourless mineral spirits, Sandstore by Winsor Newton. I'm just going to mix up a fairly wet consistency with the brown, just enough so that I can flick it against a little stick and create these little splatters. And on my high-tech miniature holding contraption, I can now just start to flick that onto the model. And you can already see we're getting tons of these little splatters. It was one of my favourite stages, this. If we have any large spots, we can take a little bit of thinner on our brush and just touch it towards that large dot. And what this will do is just diffuse those larger dots out. So again, it looks a little bit more like a stain. So as if it's soaked into the fabric. So add a little one there. Then just add some thinner in. The oil paint has a very matte finish. It's very similar to the cloth underneath it. And now I'm going to do exactly the same with that dust colour, though slightly less, because these light colours, they're very, very strong when we use them with oil paints, so don't want to go overboard with it. And rather than diffusing them out with a bit thinner, we can just grab a soft brush like this and just move them around a little as well. Anything to create that texture, those different colours, just that worn and torn feeling to the cloth. And the last step is I'm taking a little bit of the thinned down burnt umber, the brown. I've thinned this down a touch further. I'm just going to wash a little bit of this into a few of the recesses just to create a build up of dirt. I've left the oils to dry overnight, and now I come back with a slightly lighter version of my base colour, so that I used Screamer Pink originally, so I've just mixed a little bit of an off-white into there. And I'm going to stipple along a few of the raised creases in the cloth. And again, we could leave it there. You can leave it at any stage. As I say, with this I'm just trying to show you a few fun techniques that we can use. So we just stipple along a few of the edges to bring a little bit of that colour back. And I particularly focus up towards the top of the miniature, because that then means we have sort of the cloth getting dirtier and dirtier as it goes towards the floor. Another nice way of getting a bit of texture in is we can just start applying tons and tons of little scratches with that lighter colour in. And the key here really is just to keep your paint fairly thin. Use a brush with a nice point on it. I think this one's ready to give up and be put in the oil paint pile, I think. And again, do as much or as little of this as you want. It's just all about adding texture into the model, making it more interesting to look at. We're not worrying too much about realism here, not even worrying hugely about rendering light sources or anything like that. We're just trying to create tons and tons of texture. So there we go, a few simple products and techniques that we can use across all different kinds of material, just to muddy them up, weather them up, and just getting them looking worn and torn and interesting. All together on the model, it's going to be pretty full on, but I think quite exciting to look at. And I'll make sure when I do finally get that box of Cursed City done, I'll post some pictures up. So thanks ever so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.